Hi, welcome to this session from the Open Security Summit on Wardley Maps. This is going to be a really interesting session where Steve and James are going to walk you through actually some work they did with us at Glasswall, but more importantly, I think it's some great examples of trying to use it in real world scenarios. And also, I think also a good example of the kind of stuff that we want to do more at the Open Security Summit, where it's about collaborating, sharing ideas, and then talking and discussing. And please, feel free to ask questions during this. I'm not sure how many slides you got, Steve, but I remember for some of the ones you created, we had tons. So we might need a couple of more sessions. But the point of this is to do this every month. So, don't feel that you have to cover everything today. What we'll do is we'll also make sure to put the slides on the, what's it called, on the sides for the, to share with this. And also all this is released on the Creative Commons, right, Steve?
Yeah, that's right.
So everybody can share, collaborate, manipulate, remix, whatever you want. So over to you, Steve and James. Yeah, maybe do an intro, I think, to you guys. Might be good.
Yeah, don't worry. We can cover that. So yeah, I'll just get started in terms of time. Just to give you an idea of how we've got today's plan. So this is how today's session is going to be organized. So first, I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour of Glasswall's use of Wardley Maps and services so far. And yeah, that way you'll have some context and such, right? So Dennis mentioned that there's a lot of slides. I'm going to skip over a lot of detail. There were over 100 slides in the original deck. We've only got an hour. And we're going to split this up into two sections, right? So first, that whirlwind tour. Second, we've invited Christoph Daniel and Mark Craddock to join a panel discussion to explore this in more detail. So they've had a look through the 100-page deck and got some questions for us. But also to everybody out there on the call, just feel free to jump in during the panel session to ask questions or make comments. Yeah, right. So. In today's session, I'm going to assume a general awareness of what Wardley mapping is, but as a quick recap, so I know people aren't using this on a daily basis. So a Wardley map is a chain of needs. It's drawn from the perspective of a user, where you've got the more visible things towards the top, and each link represents some flow of value. So for example, needs met, or could be finance, could be energy, risk, carbon emissions, etc. And it's got this added dimension of evolution on the bottom, right? So you've got new and less understood on the left, common and more well understood on the right. Of course, Wardley mapping is much, much more than the maps. It's a strategy cycle. It's a set of climatic patterns and an evidenced set of universally applicable principles called Doctrine. It's also got over 60 published forms of context-specific gameplay for strategy. I know Simon's got more, and other people have got their own. Yeah, so it's all of that. The technique is named after Simon Wardley, who created over a decade ago, and James Duncan, who joins us today, is often cited as the co-creator of Wardley mapping. Anyway, that's enough of a recap. Like I said, I'm going to assume that you've got some grounding in this. So let's get started. So yeah, so we were brought into Glasswall a couple of months ago by Dennis, just after they'd landed a new customer and they were ramping up to deliver. So Dennis, their CTO, he wanted to introduce Wardley Maps to improve the team's situational awareness and to organize more effectively. So he reached out and asked for our help. For those of you who don't know Glasswall and Open Security Summit, a lot of you probably do, but for those of you perhaps watching the recording after the fact, it'd be useful to know who they are. So they're in the content security space, and their product, Glasswall Rebuild, turns the typical antivirus model on its head. So they do something called content disarm and reconstruction, CDR, which to me essentially means you take a file that may have some malicious content in it and you rebuild it from known good components so that it looks exactly like the original, which you then chuck away. So you chuck away that original rather than trying to scan it for an ever-growing list of threats, and deliver the copy to the content consumer, because to keep them safe, right? So they're safe because they only ever see that copy that you rebuilt and you know is okay. So that's Glasswall. That's Glasswall's core product in a nutshell. So they've got a few products and services like email and API, solutions developer kit, but their new customer had a different set of needs. And so they wanted Glasswall rebuilt to slot into their existing proxy solution so that they could improve the security of an internal Microsoft SharePoint site. And the plan was to do this using what's called the Internet Content Adaptation Protocol, or ICAP. And this was all new territory for Glasswall. So to deliver, they had to acquire a number of new skills. And this meant climbing learning curves, and the pressure was on. To speed up the pace, they decided to complement their internal workforce with external experts and also with temporary talent from a platform called Upwork. So you hear that word quite a lot through the rest of the session. So Upwork's I think it's basically a freelancing platform where you can recruit in talent. The idea was great, right? And in practice, we saw lots of value being delivered. And again, I am going to just whirlwind tour through this, right? So I'm not going to stop and dig into too much stuff. As with many budding change efforts, it felt chaotic. And here, yeah, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. So I've forgotten to introduce myself. I'm Steve. I'm the founder of a consulting company called Complex Adaptive. And I've partnered with James Duncan's company, Stance, to help Glasswall with these three things: establishing the practice of Wardley Mapping and building capability around it, evaluating the current state of universal doctrine of the engineering team, and the third one is reviewing how they're organized, and of course, recommending changes. So what we're showing you today, as Dennis mentioned earlier, is an overview of how Glasswall's maps have evolved over the past few months and where we're headed next. And it's all possible because Dennis has decided to release this work under Creative Commons. So to help Glasswall learn how to map, right? So that was number one objective. So for that, I ran an intro to mapping session for all the team members to join. That's actually been recorded and available publicly as well, and the slide deck for that too. So if you're learning, then we've got some resources for you that you can draw on. There's also lots of great resources out there on the internet. We've ran after that a series of 3 workshops that were focused on first discovering what each team had as user needs, right? So what user needs they served, along with their capabilities and dependencies, what they needed. Second, we took those components basically and turned those answers into a value chain. And then third, we converted that value chain into a map, into a Wardley map. I'll give you some examples of this in a second. But next up, we looked at Doctrine, right? So Doctrine was number 2 goal on the list, right? So we conducted a Doctrine assessment to get a feel for what Glasswall was doing and thus what it was important not to break. And that would also give us an idea where the opportunities to improve were. So here's a quick view of what Doctrine is, just as a quick reminder. And of course, there was making changes and recommendations to the organizational structure. So looking back on the overall effort the past couple of months, this is how I've made sense of the effort. So here you can see it's very zoomed out. There's actually a mural board behind this that you can interact with, zoom in and out of. But here it's organized like this, right? So vertically, it shows those 3 levels of mapping workshops that we conducted, plus this other content at the bottom. So that's for things like technical architecture and how Doctrine fit in and things like that. So we've got those 3 levels of mapping workshops. Vertically and horizontally, it follows the different stages that Glasswall went through with the use of the flexible workforce, so with Upwork. So here we started with Upwork as product development teams. And yeah, the teams at this point were building prototypes of the product, investigating technical questions, providing feedback to architectural discussions and such. Next, we see the flexible Upwork workforce being used as service teams, where we did an experiment with a cell-based operating model. And third, we saw the Upwork talent being used as product testers, providing feedback on the final solution that was being developed by the internal Glasswall team. Finally, the one thing that remained constant throughout so far has been the Upwork used as corporate services, such as video and content editing or data visualization. All right, so that's just a very quick overview of how I made sense of things. Let's have a look at some of the highlights. So to get the ball rolling, get people creating Wardley maps and the value chain mapping in the first place is, I thought about a couple of different options, and one of which we went ahead with was to create some seeds, right? So this is the first seed that we created. It really helped us to understand the purpose of the many Upwork teams that have been created, and we collaborated with the teams to create it. So we referred back to it a lot in our initial workshops, and it generated a lot of aha moments, I'd say, as teams began to understand how their work fit into the bigger picture. It also helped the teams to learn how to create the value chains with context-specific examples, and that's really important. Here's another seed. It's generic product development needs. And you can see the influence of these value chains here in many of the team's later maps. So we took those seeds and we ran the various sessions, as I say, right? So the first map to be created was around user simulation and testing, and it demonstrated the process that we use nicely. So first we start with the 6 questions. Who are your users? What are their high-level needs? How do you meet them? What do you rely on, both internally and externally? And how do you manage work? There's also a sneaky 7th one in there that tries to prompt thinking about the market perception of what that team is doing. So what would happen if your team didn't exist? And that gets you thinking about evolution, as I say. Secondly, from the answers of that, you create a value chain from the user needs, and the capabilities and the dependencies that were highlighted by those 6 questions, like this. And third, you create a Wardley map derived from that value chain. So here you can see the evolution of some of the components on the map we used to constructively challenge the architectural decisions that have been made. And the resulting discussions around that, they uncovered a lack of business oversight and involvement in some cases, which Glasswall could then address, which is not bad for a first map. In this next example, the sessions that we ran led to a discussion on strategy. So as we went through the 6 questions with various teams, we realized that there was a lot of duplication going on. And this is kind of getting back to that earlier point on it felt a little bit chaotic. So there were quite a few Upwork teams, and they're all doing very similar things. And that was initially it was very tricky to navigate. But out of these sessions, we still extracted value, and we made a first attempt here. You can see of mapping Glasswall's ICAP proxy CDR. So their Glasswall rebuild inside a ICAP proxy. And it was completely wrong, of course, but it was the first attempt, and that's okay. Maps are there to help you learn. And that we did, right? So we refined this into the Kubernetes core map, which itself prompted a great discussion on Glasswall's potential strategies. So I still remember that conversation with Dennis. He had some great feedback on it, and you can see all these wonderful scribbles, if you will. But they all had a lot of good meaning, and really they contributed back into the service experiment, which you'll see in a moment. But another interesting thing for me that happened at this point was that it confirmed that prompting the cloud providers to improve their Kubernetes as a service offering was not Glasswall's strategy, as I had initially suspected. But yeah, it would be nice if that happened. Was Dennis's point of view. So anyways, so we parked the strategy discussion to focus on the other goals that we talked about. So before we go into services, let's first talk about principles. So the teams were learning how to map, and at the same time, we ran a Doctrine survey with the technical leadership team and a few others. You can see the aggregated results here. And if you just focus on only the technical leadership team, you get a slightly different view, which I think is very interesting in and of itself. Both of them actually highlight, in phase 1, the same focus, though. So you can see 2 key areas of improvement. Removing duplication and bias, which we saw, as I've mentioned, a lot of in the teams that we interviewed, and also using a systematic mechanism of learning. We confirmed this focus in a workshop with the leadership team, and we also actually noted that there are a number of other improvements and even blockers even in the green areas. So Again, this is just showing how Doctrine can be used to decide how to navigate, right? And from this Doctrine assessment, we did exactly that. So we were recommended to adopt Stance's organized services operating model to address some of these challenges. So a bit about that, because this is, I think, fundamental. So rather than using a classical functional hierarchy, a services model uses a network of cells that each deliver a set of carefully articulated needs. Each cell has got a specific service agreement, which governs how the service is delivered. And this doubles as a fitness function to evaluate the performance of that service. Each cell is managed by a service manager who's accountable for designing, building, operating, and supporting the service. So no bimodal IT. And to represent the customer where they can't be present, in particular if you're an externally facing cell, a service owner is appointed. An executive team governs these services by mandating the strategic considerations rather than getting bogged down in the day-to-day tactical decision-making, using tools for situational awareness, like maps, in the decision-making process as to whether or not a service should be changed or retired, or if a new service should be created. And all of this is derived from Simon's universal doctrine by James and his team. So a lot of the mapping that we did culminated in one simplified map, which we used to base an experiment with services on. And this is that map. So it drew on the architecture, the maps, the value chains, all done to date. To address the growing problem of duplicated effort and associated communication issues, then we proposed making one person accountable for each service. With relevant multiple projects that were ongoing falling under their purview. We agreed to trial a service delivery manager role and recruited from an existing pool of delivery managers. So once that was done, we worked with work teams to draft service agreements like this one. And forgive me, I'm going through this quickly. I know this is a whirlwind tour. We'll dig into relevant points of interest afterwards as we go through the discussion. Finally, we helped the teams make sense of how their work fit into the services model. So for example, the InfoSec team, the sessions that we did with them produced examples of how the executive team could govern via mandates. The services experiment showed promising signs, but it was incomplete because it didn't include any of the internal Glasswall teams. And given the priorities, there just wasn't time to do that. So we put the services experiment on hold to focus the flexible workforce on helping Glasswall's final delivery push. So maps were used here to visualize different versions of Glasswall's ICAP proxy. It showed where additional components were needed to use the solution in production, and also, if you will, give a delta across the different versions. So here we're seeing the first version, right? So the first ICAP proxy that was built on Docker by the Upwork teams. And results from this and the next one, Kubernetes, fed into, as I mentioned before, into architectural discussions and design. In the second map, you can see what components the Upwork teams added to get things running on Kubernetes. In this third one, you can see the components that the internal team had delivered and the difference between the experiments that were done earlier by the Upwork teams. And finally, in this map, you can see what an Upwork team had to do to test the internal team's product and get it installed, actually working in production for this website. So if you step back a little bit, Dennis's vision here was to see components on the map moving from one release to the next. And that's it for the Whirlwind Tour, right? So what I wanted to do was try and limit this to about 20 minutes or so that we could actually get into, as I say, into a panel discussion. So now I'd like to welcome Christoph, Mark, and James. And maybe if we, I'll just pause my share here and you guys could introduce yourselves for a sec. Christoph, you want to go first?
Okay, so my name is Chris Daniel. I work for the Leading Edge Forum and I teach people how to map.
Cool, welcome. Mark?
Hi, I'm Mark Raddick. I'm the co-founder of Ducati. So we're developing some Wardley mapping training and certifications, amongst other things.
Cool. Welcome. And James.
Hello, I'm James Duncan. I'm sort of equally responsible for some of this work for my sins, and I've had a small hand in, as Steve said, putting together Wardley mapping in the first place, and then following on from that, some of the organized services operating model that is derived from Doctrine.
Great. Okay, so yeah, I'm just going to open up the floor to questions.
Steve, can I go first then? Steve?
By all means, yeah.
Yeah, so I got a question on how you did the Doctrine assessment. So you said you did a survey. Did you use any tools? And did you find, because it was a survey, people told you what they thought you wanted to hear and not what they were actually doing?
Yep. Yeah, so for that, we did use a survey tool, Google Forms. Basically. Oops, I think there's a bit of an echo there. Sorry about that. Yeah, so we used Google Forms, which we can actually show you the survey. I was going to dig it up. And yeah, James, do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because you did that together. I'll dig it up and screen share it.
Sure. So I mean, it was a simple Google form with there's definitely a big echo. I think it's coming from
Kieran, I think, yeah, I think you're
multi. There we go. That's better.
Thanks, Kieran.
So thanks. There was it was a very very sort of unnuanced view. In the same way that Doctrine is presented often, you know, do you do this thing rarely? Do you do it sometimes? Do you do it frequently? And a very simplified view of each of the articles of Doctrine. And then from that, it's sort of it's just an aggregated view. It's a very straightforward analysis. There's no simplicity in it. What I find is that there's all sorts of ways you can cut this stuff. There's many different ways you could perform the analysis, but in the final analysis, what I find is a blunt view is often the better one, because you're trying to establish a position, you're trying to decide what to do next, and so it's in fact nuance sometimes doesn't help, and certainly from that broad net that you're trying to cast. You want to get a view of things you can address. You can then ask some more sensible questions once you have decided to dig down into a particular thing, and that's why the workshop was conducted following the initial survey. Does that help answer the question a bit?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, Steve, you're going to share the tool, are you? It'd be interesting to see that.
Yep. So this, I'm screen sharing it at the moment.
Well, I say tool, it's a form, yeah.
Yeah. So it's a Google form that you can see
right.
here.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
And yeah, it's just got, as James mentioned, really it's a rarely to often for each one of the doctrine, the principles.
So did you ask everybody to complete the form and then get like an aggregate answer compiled kind of?
No, so we segmented the population into various audiences. So we asked the executive, we asked a number of service delivery managers, we asked a number of individuals from the internal team, and by segmenting the population, I think sometimes the most interesting thing with a doctrinal analysis is in fact looking at the differences between those population segments. So the comparison between the executive and everyone else, for example, is always a really interesting one. And funnily enough, I think what matters more or less is alignment across the things. That's I would often rather see everyone agree that everything is red than I would see some people think some things are green and others think some things are red, because then it's much easier to establish a case for change.
Yeah, and that, if you go back to the presentation earlier, that's one of the things that I wanted to highlight there, was that difference between the technical leadership team and the wider audience that we polled. So I think one of the next steps really will be to expand that out across a wider segment of the company. And there were also some teething issues as well in terms of explaining Doctrine, giving context for the survey in the first place that we could have done better. So that we've learned from.
That's what I was going to say. So I think there was definitely, a number of people that they did this and they kind of understood Wardley Maps or even Doctrine. There's already a good level of adoption of Wardley Maps, at least by some part of the organization. And there was definitely a number of people that looking at it going, whoa.
Oh, Dennis, you've gone really faint. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. And there's a number of people that also said, whoa, what's going on this, right? So I think, yeah. I guess this is the kind of thing that the more we do Wardley Maps, the more it will be, these data will be much more meaningful. What I would say strategically, what I like about this, and even just doing that survey, is that one of the unintended consequences, positive, actually, unintended consequences of just going to that list, it starts to also show what kind of behavior we're trying to promote, right? So I found that even just reading that aligns you with, okay, this is how we should be thinking, right? So I think there's even an insane amount of value of just doing that. In fact, I want to do that regularly with the team, because I think there's a lot of value. Keep reinforcing those messages.
Hey, this actually touches a very important issue, and I was going to ask it from almost the beginning. If you say that showing the doctrine aligns people, have you observed maybe sustained usage of Wardley mapping in the organization? Because what you have done is we've created lots of maps with different teams, and I wonder whether those practices started living by themselves, or do you still have to animate them? And if they started living, if they are by themselves, was there an inflection point after which the thing just took off?
I think the answer to that is we're not there yet. So one of the issues, one of the limitations I think that we ran into was how busy the Glasswall internal team was, and that limited their ability to get involved in the mapping effort. So we ended up with a lot more of the temporary, the flexible workforce getting involved. And there, a number of people. I was impressed with one team using Plant UML to create a map without me being involved. Right, it's brilliant. But that was, I think that was the one example. And there, I know that more of the internal team were interested in getting involved, as I say, but just didn't have the time because of the delivery commitments. So that's one thing to grow on. And one of the recommendations that we've made as well is to focus more on the internal team, and to have that internal team complemented by this flexible workforce, but not necessarily driven by it, if you will, right? So if we build up their capability to be self-sustaining is the goal.
I think there's a bit of a, I think also there's a bit of a sort of snake chasing the tail. If you want, it's so one of the reasons I tend to focus on Doctrine when I speak to people rather than mapping is because understanding the need for situational awareness is considerably easier for most people than, hey, here's this new technique for visualizing your organization, now it interacts with everything in the world ever. That's a hard sell. Saying you need to have better situational awareness, that's a thing that you can hook on and understand, and having understood that, you can then explore techniques for how you might develop that situational awareness. Oh, by the way, here's a technique. It's called Wardley Mapping. Here you go. Whereas the other way around, it just, I find that it doesn't land.
Thank you, James. And I think you have answered the next question that I had, which is, how do you know that you are in the right place doing the right thing? Because in the presentation, you mentioned that you first created the maps and then you started discussion about the strategy. And in the strategy cycle, the first element is identifying your landscape and basically figuring out what's your environment first before you dig into how you are delivering the value. You basically answered that it's easier in the beginning to focus on situational awareness.
But I think you need to take into account that, I've been using mapping, right? So I don't think these guys didn't land in a project where mapping wasn't, at least, on the cards, or at least I would say that the whole practice of knowing what to build, what to commoditize, what's the strategy, I would say that underneath the hood, there was already a lot of it there, right? I think one of my favorite slides from James was, I think, or Steve, who says there's science behind the madness or something like that, right? And so I think in this case, again, you know, when they were starting to do the maps, in a way, they almost lifting a structure that was already there, right? It wasn't explicit because, you know, it wasn't kind of, you know, defined. But also, if you look at Luke, for example, who's on the call, like he's already a big fan of Wardley Maps. So there's already a lot of people in the company who's starting to think like that. I think Wardley Maps gives us a common language, but we're very far from where we need to be, right? And like, you know, James was saying, you know, like the Doctrine is a great place to start because there's a lot more hooks into it, right? In fact, on my first board meeting, you know, I showed the Doctrine, not a map, right? I put some of the things that I said, you know, when I joined Glasswall, I focus on a lot of those entities.
Thanks. That explains a lot.
So I had a quick question. This is Rob Seringer, and I'm a big fan. Really interesting work that you've done. Are there any metrics, like hardcore metrics, that are associated to any of the maps or anything that you've done in this exercise?
Can you give an example of the kind of thing you might be looking for? I mean, I don't know if the answer is yes or no yet, but from your question, I don't have a good feel for what you're looking for.
Any financial metrics? Any, let's say, reduction in decision times? You know, you're making an organizational change or proposed organizational change. Curious to see if, you know, you, let's say, yeah, that's where I was going first.
So I think we're early yet in terms of looking for some of those answers. I think initially, when you make any sort of organizational change like this, the first things you're going for are the qualitative measures, because the quantitative measures, you almost have to make the qualitative measures occur first in order to start addressing some of the quantitative things you can measure, because you just haven't been measuring them before. I think very early on, what we expect to see and what we see in other organizations where this model is sort of followed all the way down is that the clarity of where spend is happening increases dramatically. And in a lot of organizations, specifically technology organizations, they become very divorced. Where the spend happens becomes very divorced, even in the accounting system, from where it's actually happening. It becomes really opaque and really hard to figure out. Whereas when you deconstruct an organization into its services that it delivers, and budget accountability follows that service line, and capital flow follows the service line throughout the organization, the clarity of where that spend is happening immediately increases. And that's not to say that immediately has a downward pressure on the spend in total, but what it does is it makes it clear where you can apply a downward pressure, and that I think is advantageous. So are we there yet? No, we're a long way from being there yet, but we're starting to make those changes that will allow that sort of thing to happen.
Thank you. Yep, I totally side with that.
And Rod, what I would say, like from an exec point of view, right? Like one of the things we're doing is that, you know, we're challenging the business, right, to do all this work, and there's lots of moving parts. One of the nice things of this piece of work is that it allows me to give visibility, right, to the business and say, look, we know what we're doing, right? Now we got a structure. And in fact, you know, the thing about technology and software products, you know, after a while, it's not even a money problem, right? Like there's most projects where it doesn't matter if you have unlimited funds, right? Like you cannot throw enough resources to a thing. And, you know, sometimes you can even slow it down. What I like about this structure, for example, like there's a slide that Steve talked about, you know, actually there was a really cool sequence where he talked about initially that the teams were doing research, then they become, they test the thing, then they become, what was it, service, and then become product testers. Like what you see there was really big pivots into the team structure that we were able to do because we had a lot more understanding and mapping, right, of what the teams were doing. Like the services team became a really good language to explain the teams what we were doing, right? So I have to say that from a business point of view, this structure or thinking like this, or even trying to address these issues, is allowing me to align the resources that we have to the places of maximum effectiveness, right? And I think that's what you want. You want to make sure that your resources and your finance investment is as aligned, right, with what you can do. And this capability does that. And what it allows us to do moving forward, right, is we now getting to the point, and Luke's on the call, although he's being silent now, but allows his team to really start to quantify the costs of each of those areas. And we are really, really close. In fact, we already got a good sense of where things are, because we actually have mapped, and Luke, chime in, please. We literally, if you look at some of these maps, we actually mapped cost centers to almost every one of those.
Yep. So I completely agree. I agree with you that you needed a language to be able to navigate innovation. And Wardley in his maps clearly shows the pioneers, for example, have a different approach and a need for a common language. I think that the point to get to settlers is something that I think takes time, and yes, this will help you get there too.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, this is Rocco. Hi. I've got a question. I'm relatively new to the Wardley maps, but very interested in, and thank you for today for offering these insights. It's very interesting to me. I have a question from a technical architecture point of view. I just had a brief view on the maps you have shown, and the Kubernetes popped up a lot often. And I asking myself whether you also asked you and your efforts and your operational burdens you have with operating a Kubernetes cluster with your teams, and challenging this, for example, with serverless options. Yeah, this is from me a value chain aspect, which I think could be Wardley maps could be beneficial too. To compare different operational models and efforts with different technologies. Yeah.
Well, we can do that actually. Steve, can you pop in one of the maps, right? And we can actually walk you through this. In fact, I had a question for Chris and Rod and Mark, which I want to ask in a second. But if you show one of the ones that show the multiple components of the multiple versions, I think that's a good one. So one of the things I think is further down, Steve.
Okay, yeah, so I mean, this is the one where we first started looking at the link between the architecture and the value chain itself. The services model itself is although it's not really answering your question, but it is based on the architecture as well, right? So, and this is a view of the architecture and how where the services kind of sit around that architectural diagram. But yeah, it doesn't. So we didn't dig into alternative models in terms of serverless versus Kubernetes, as that was already Kubernetes was already a given, I think.
But I can explain quickly, right? Because I think it's a very valid question. And I think Wardley Maps allows us to do that. So if you go back to, yeah, just show me one of those diagrams that has the architecture. No, the one that has all the boxes, the one that has the actual expansion of the deployment. You know, when you have the SOW version and then the next version down.
Yep.
So it's
yeah. Let me. So
it's on your presentation.
This view here, or is there is there another?
That was there. Yeah, that was there. 78, 76.
Okay.
Right. So can you just present? So I'll walk you through it. So basically, what you have here, right, is basically a view of the architecture, right? And I think I can annotate here, so I can walk you through from a technical point of view, right? The question here is that, you know, we got this user here, right, that wants to sort of rebuild the file, right? They want to send a file through to, something like this guy, and then say, give me a file back, right? Now, what we looked at is we say, okay, we could use serverless, right? We can use serverless, which is here, which by the way, we have, right? Like we actually did, if you actually go to the Glasswall store, you can buy a serverless thing. So we know the problem is serverless has tons of limitations. And by the way, the current serverless implementation of Lambda is not really serverless, right? It's like basically there's a huge amount of state being persistent between one request to the other, which means for us, it's a no-go because we have to assume that the container is dirty after each file executed, right? So we then look, right, at solutions like Docker, right? So we now look at how we can do Docker, and then one interesting challenge, right, and Kubernetes. So one interesting challenge, and actually Steve, right, challenged us in the beginning and say, hey, why are you building your Kubernetes cluster when you can use AKS, right? Let's just use AKS, which is a commodity here, right? Now, the problem is, again, AKS doesn't scale for our level. We found lots of gaps in AKS. We found that there's lots of thresholds that they have. We actually implemented, ironically, an AKS version initially to solve us some acceleration, which we then end up paying, a lot of technical debt because, it wouldn't scale. So this is a good example of.
Of course, yeah. I know what you mean. I have the same issues with the EKS, and you have a lot of debt and lots of burden you have to care about with your teams if you want to use it.
So the way I would map your AKS is just say, although AKS is here as a product, I will argue that the practices are here, right? So you actually can have a situation where you go, oh, hold on, I might have my practice. I believe actually the practices we're talking about are here. So you have a situation where your practices actually might be sitting on top of something which, although might be a bit, commoditized, the reality is you have a huge amount of attrition now being caused by this use here. So the irony is, so the approach that we took was we said, this actually is the solution, all of it. So I was supposed to highlight the other ones. So we're basically saying that Kubernetes is the solution, and we're building a whole product on top of the idea that you spin up a Kubernetes cluster, and that should have just about everything it needs in order to work, right? So we basically are commoditizing our product, which becomes a Kubernetes application. And of course, in the future, we always would try to use whatever commoditized services exist. But it's a good example of this allow us to say, look, let's not, spend a lot of time on Kubernetes, at least because the pod management already does that, but let's spend time on the deployment, the scalability, auto provisioning, because that's the bits that today are not fully solved. And actually, the question I have,
it's probably worth going back to one of the early maps on that, because that explained, if you will, at least, or visualized what your intent was there, right? So it's this one here. I'm just going to get it back.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
And here you can see, for example, so this idea of managed Kubernetes as a service that you get from AKS or EKS or whatever is suffering from these three things, right? So portability, security, and performance, which is really what's driven Glasswall to go with their own, roll your own, right? And this is where I was thinking initially, put pressure on these guys.
Does that mean that you host your own Kubernetes and you manage your own Kubernetes?
Yes. In fact, so we have an architecture that is basically almost designed to become multi-cloud, right, from the get-go. In fact, the first two implementations we're doing, solid implementations, is one based on Azure and one based on VMware. And the logic is that we spin everything from the ground up using Rancher, and we use as little cloud dependencies as possible. So, and what it gives us is a huge amount of portability, and allow us to be able to really tweak the Kubernetes sort of environment to our need, which is in this case is to be able to start pods insanely fast and to use one pod per file. And just for reference, we're building an architecture that can handle up to 100,000 pods at the same time, which is basically, so we're focusing on creating clusters that can run between 1,000 and 5,000 pods, and then we just spin up, 20 of those.
So, and these basics are, if correct me if I'm wrong, Dennis, but are being open sourced, right? So
Yeah.
so
The
that
whole thing is open source.
thing.
Yeah.
So, and that to me is actually a great, even though it may not be intentional to put pressure on the cloud providers, so AKS, EKS, etc., it does exactly that, right? So, and if enough people start doing this, then these portability, security, and performance, these needs will start to be taken into account by the managed providers. So that will break down this barrier here.
Mm-hmm. So can you go to that? So the question I had for Chris and Mark and the other guys, right? Because I think me and Steve and James had this debate, right? So I'll be interested to see your views. Is one of the conversations we had was, can you go back to the one with my scribbles?
The next one. Yeah.
One of the conversations we had was where to put things in the node in here, right? In the map. And what you see here, right? And let me squiggle, maybe they're different squiggles on top of squiggles, right? What you see, for example, with this move here from those to that point there is my point was that instead of, for example, saying that because, for example, Kubernetes is mature, or actually let's change color. So instead of saying Kubernetes is mature, which should be, for example, here, right? My point would be if the knowledge of the team is immature, then at the moment I want to track it here, right? And then measure the evolution from left to right. Right. So the logic would be, and then actually, can you go back to the one we had before, which is the one where everything was on it, which is the one
this one or the
other one.
Full,
yeah. And so the question here, right, is, what do you think of this model, right, where you put on a map not where the industry today is at, but where the teams are at with a particular component, and then which is exactly that. Right. Actually, no, the other one is better because it had more lines. The one that you literally just had. So here, so what you got here, right, on the left is the team's understanding and the practices for some of these techniques, right? And then what we want is to move that to the left, to the right. And my argument would be that where these guys are today is the point of attrition, i.e., that's the moment where you're going to struggle to go beyond that, because you reach industry almost, capability. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
And the coolest thing of this is that you now can track the teams, right? Because, for example, a more mature team actually will start here, right? A more mature team already knows how to use Helm charts and Kubernetes and VMware, etc., and knows how to, or Rancher, where, for example, you could say that Rancher is either here or there, depends how you want to put it, right? But I would argue that when the team started, Rancher was here, right? In fact, it was kind of over there even, right? Because nobody used it.
So I'm afraid that in this case, I can offer a comment which will not be very helpful because it all depends. The trick is that if you want to be pedantic, you would probably put the existing state of the art on the map, like it's out there in the world, and you would add a component which say your company's skills in handling that component, and they would be probably in the beginning in the genesis, and they would slowly try to close the gap as you are moving to the, let's say, industry state of the art.
Yep.
But this is the pedantic approach. And if you would imagine this approach applied to every skill and component you have, you would get a map that is impossible to read. So at this point, I would say that a good map is a useful map, and the useful map is a good map. So you have to make compromises and you have to remove certain components. So for me, it makes perfect sense to remove components which don't contribute much value to the map. And if the primary purpose of the map is to show how the adoption of a particular components work within an organization, and everyone knows that those are best practices or best components in the product or commodity space, then perhaps it's not worth to add them to the map because they will just make the map more difficult to read. Right? So it all goes back to, it depends what you want to show.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would give a different answer, or a different take on it, in that the team on the left will always be the team on the left because of their skills and capabilities and their attitude to novel and new things. What there should be is a team in the middle stealing the stuff from the team on the left, and then there should be a team on the right stealing the stuff from the team in the middle, so that you pull your capabilities to the right and into the kind of commodity utility model. And on like the Kubernetes and there's also so on Wardley maps you can also map your practices as on top of the same map or in a separate map, but you'll have the co-evolution of new practices on top of. So where you say Kubernetes is on the right hand side as a commodity, but knowing how to use Kubernetes, build stuff, make it reliable, make it scale, would be on the left, but that will be a new practice based on the commoditization of Kubernetes on the right hand side.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
And
The
so
only thing I
so the
would
map
say-
is fine.
And
Yeah.
actually, what's interesting about what you said is that we actually initially even in Slack, we actually had Slack channels for, we call PST and TP, right? Which was like the Pioneer Settlers and Town Planners, right? And actually the way we did this project was our internal team was acting like town planners. So they were basically the ones who would go, like they feel building the final product, they're putting everything together. And our Upwork team behaved a lot like pioneers and settlers, because in fact, you could say, actually, Steve, can you go back to that one where you had the 4 phases, right? Where actually we can even see that really well. The 4 phases that ends up with being product users and started as, what's it called? As developers, as research. So yeah, the 4 phases of the teams, right? That we actually did exactly that. So we had our internal team acting as the settlers, right? And then what you actually have here is correct. So if you want to maximize that, what you actually had here is a case where when the team was doing, it's not this one, you had a better one. No. It's the one where you had, is it the one where you talk about different products where they became a user? Remember, no, it's not this one. I think you had better one.
So they become a user over, I don't know if you can see my cursor over here, but
they can,
on the right hand side,
So this was basically what we call settlers, where the teams were doing a lot of research on Kubernetes. We're doing research on RabbitMQs, Rancher, Knative. We did lots of different projects, which is one of the things when Steve says there was a bit of duplication at the beginning. I would say part of it is my fault, because I actually gave multiple teams similar tasks, each one trying to find a particular solution. So I would actually say that, sorry, that's not set, that's P, sorry. I would actually say in pioneer work, you do have a bit of duplication, because you do actually get people figuring out multiple things. But then you can actually probably say that these 2 next phases were a lot more about the team actually become a settler, right? Where they were actually using, in a way, we actually, if you think about our town planner team being the one that, for at Glasswall internal team, these guys were actually producing what we call the SOW version, where these guys, the S team here was basically first trying to implement, and then of course feeding back up. But then eventually they would give these guys actually a version to play with, and they become product users, but also settlers to trying to get that to almost become a productized version, right? So I think we did a little bit of that, pioneer, settlers, and then town planners. Actually, can you show that next? Can you show that diagram where the Upwork, Steve? Because that also showed that quite nicely.
Not sure which one you mean, sorry.
The one where you show the handover between the multiple teams. You had it at the beginning.
Okay, yeah, that. Which is in this deck is at the bottom, of course, just to confuse me.
Yeah. So in this case, what you actually have is you have the internal team being the town planners, right? Who actually throw up something that then this team, they throw pioneer requests or settler requests to the Upwork teams, who then inform their internal team. So that's how we got this feedback loop playing around. And that actually, I would say, worked quite well. Of course, it can be improved, the workflows.
Great. I'm aware we're almost out of time here, so I'm just thinking if there's one more quick question, we probably have time for it. Otherwise, we'll look at closing down.
Yeah, quick one for me, Steve.
Anyone?
Yeah,
Yep.
quick one for me. You said it's all Creative Commons, Steve. Where can we find it?
Yeah, so that I'll be publishing at least this brief view to SlideShare. I can post about it on Twitter and such. But yeah, so Dennis, I'm not sure if you've got this up already, but we'll coordinate and share a link on the Open Security Summit site.
Yeah, but if you just want to show the main repo organization, just open in GitHub, is what we call the K8 Proxy Organization. So if you go into the K8 Proxy in GitHub, maybe just want to open that up, yep. And if you guys take a look at that, all our projects, all the Kubernetes, all the map, actually most of the mapping should be already, if not there, Steve, you need to put it there, right? But we should already have, yeah, that's where everything should be, right?
Yeah, and, this is where we've organized the board. Yeah, so we'll put the final version here.
Yeah, but actually, can you just show the repo which starts with VMware, I think. Sorry. And if you guys want to, from a technical point of view, I'm just finding the repo for you.
Is it this one that I'm sharing at the moment?
No, it's not that one. It is the who has all the documentation.
Oh, right, yeah.
Which is
yeah, I think I know the one you mean.
So if you just search for EXI, just EXS, sorry. No, yeah, that one. You add it. Yeah. So if you go to this guy and you go to the wiki, right, you'll see all the information. We can just put the link on the chat. Yeah, you can get this. This is one of the structures we've created. If you scroll down, there's a bunch of OVAs that you can download. And there's videos, there's installation instructions, and a whole lot. Cool. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks, Steve and James for putting all this together. And then please come up with more topics for us to do at the next month's Open Security Summit. And by the way, we're having an AIMA Ask Me Anything session with Simon Wardley, right, on Thursday. So please, if you have any questions, start putting them on the Slack channel of the Open Security Summit, right? Because I have a couple, but it'd be good if you have a couple of good questions from you guys or anybody on the community. So we get Simon to actually answer the questions.
Cool.
Nice one.
Yeah,
brilliant.
Thanks for sharing everything.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.